Ladies and gentlemen, from one panel to another, actually with a close connection, I want to thank the session panelists on Russia and the Middle East, and I have the honor now to introduce Ambassador James Jeffrey, the U.S. Secretary of State's Special Representative for Syria Engagement and the Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey is the very definition of a seasoned diplomat. He earned the rank of ambassador, rising through the U.S. Foreign Service, reaching the rank of career ambassador. He served as Deputy National Security Advisor and as U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and Iraq, and we are very privileged to have him with us. He will give a brief address, and then we will have the opportunity to follow up with a few questions. Ambassador Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Steiner, and I would like to thank my friend General Amos Gilad for inviting me here. The timing of my little presentation is interesting because it comes right after an extraordinarily, I thought, brilliant discourse on much of the same subject I'm going to be discussing, which is Syria, or the Middle East, and Russia's role in it, because that's critical to what I'm about to say. I also recommend very much to all of you the book that is out there, not the book, but the summary paper, the joint study by the Kennan Institute and IDC here in Herzliya. I particularly am flogging this because up until I was called into government service, I was part of the group that was working on this. That notwithstanding, I don't know whether I'll be just repetitive with what you've heard earlier, or I can do something to complement from the U.S. government standpoint, what's going on here in this important strategic question of whether Syria, whether the security of the U.S., Israel, and our other partners and allies. Let me start with a set of numbers, because even in my own mind, it's hard, and I do this all the time, it's hard keeping track of everything related to the Syrian conflict because it is a very complex issue. First of all, 8 years that this horrific conflict has been going on, endangering the security of Israel and the other neighbors, sending waves of refugees to destabilize Europe, leading to the creation of ISIS, the most dangerous terrorist organization we have seen in the Middle East in decades. It has seen the use of chemical weapons. It has seen horrific violations of human rights, of humanitarian codes. We have seen barrel bombs. We have seen the mass incarceration of hundreds of thousands of people in this conflict. From every aspect, this conflict needs to end, and that's what I want to talk about today. One of the problems is that people think that the Assad regime has won. No, it hasn't. Let me give you some other numbers. 5 are the number of outside military forces, state forces that are engaged in Syria right now. The Russian, the Turkish, the Iranian, the United States, and a third country that usually, a fifth country that usually doesn't identify itself, that flies air operations over Syria all of the time. Another number, 50% of the Syrian population have fled their homes into areas of Syria not occupied by the Syrian government or abroad to escape the wrath and the terror of the Assad regime. 40 is the percent of Syria that the Assad regime does not control. Most of it now is more or less under the control of the Turkish army and their allies, or the U.S. and our partners in the fight against ISIS or Daesh, but nonetheless effectively not under Syrian control. 66, that's the percent of Syria's hydrocarbon resources that are not under the regime's control. So this conflict is by no means over, and the Assad regime has not won. The question is, how do we go forward? The Trump administration has 3 basic goals in Syria, and they all are complementary to each other. First, ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. Secondly, the withdrawal of Iranian forces from the entirety of Syria, and you all know why. Most of you wouldn't be here if you didn't know why, but you just got a good presentation on the dangers of these Russian forces and what they allowed to happen in Syria in the last panel. Thirdly, a political process under the relevant UN resolution 2254 from 2015 and led by the UN to generate a political process in Syria that will get to the root causes of the terrible things I've described that have happened in Syria and around it for the last 8 years. Now, some people think this is regime change focused on President Assad. He's no friend of America's, but our policy is not regime change per se. It is a set of conditions that would allow Syria to return to the international community. We have 6, so there's another number for you. First, a Syria that does not provide refuge to or encourage the development of terrorism. 2, a country that does not use chemical weapons against its own citizens or against its neighbors. 3, a country that does not endanger or threaten its neighbors in any way, including by yielding terrain to other forces that could threaten neighbors. 4, a country that does not allow the Iranians to build up offensive military bases threatening Israel and beyond Israel, other countries that are partners or allies of the United States. 5, a country that is held accountable for the horrific humanitarian and war crimes actions that we have seen in this conflict. 6th, and finally, a country that creates an environment through its social programs, through its political processes, that will allow the 12 million Syrians who have fled their homes to return. That's a tall order. How are we going about it? Basically, President Trump at the United Nations General Assembly back in September laid out 2 broad approaches. So that's another number. First, de-escalate the conflict, freeze the fighting on the battlefield, despite what's going on in Idlib, and that is a tragedy. We have basically done that while civilians have been targeted mercilessly and hundreds of thousands have fled. The regime has made very little gains on the ground in this last fighting since May. So by and large, the battle lines have been frozen. But now we want to move on, and again, the UN Resolution 2254 offers the way forward specifically to move this into the political realm. And in the political realm, again using the President's words, we want to reinvigorate the political process, moving towards those 6 end states that we want to see for Syria. How? Through the stand-up of a constitutional committee made up of 150 Syrians. Work is well underway for this. It's being held up, not surprisingly, by the Assad regime, as so much else is being held up that would be for the good of the Syrian people and for the neighborhood. And then eventually, UN supported free and fair elections for all Syrians, including those who have fled Assad's control. That is the way we would like to see this going forward. Now, how are we trying to do this? We don't talk to the Syrians and we don't talk to the Iranians, 2 of the 3 people on, if you will, Team Assad's side. We do talk to the Russians, and much of the talking is not very different than at least the themes and the general approaches and thrusts of interest are very, very similar to what you've just been hearing for the last 40 minutes. What we're trying to do is basically to put an offer on the table. We can continue the international pressure on Assad, and there's 3 kinds of pressure. There's military pressure. Again, there is the Turkish presence in the northwest. There's the American military presence in the northeast of the country, almost a third of it, and in the Al-Tanf area on the very south along the Jordanian-Iraqi border. Now, our presence is not per se to go after the Assad regime, the Iranians, or anybody else, other than to fight Daesh. And Daesh still has a presence there, and we're still going to be keeping a residual presence in this region, even though, as the President said, we're withdrawing some of our forces. That presence and our partnership with local allies basically avoids a vacuum and denies the terrain to Assad and his forces to come in and, among other things, just push the people back into the arms of ISIS. That's how they got into, that's how ISIS got its support in the first place, and we want to prevent that, having gone to so much effort to defeat ISIS on the battlefield and destroy the caliphate back in March of this year. So there is the unnamed country that is putting a great deal of military pressure on Iranian targets throughout Syria just as we speak. Economically, we have worked with our partners and friends to block any reconstruction aid flowing to regime areas. We have sanctioned the Assad regime in many different ways, and we've been joined, I'm happy to say, by the European Union, which takes a very strong position on the Assad regime and its need to reform dramatically and drastically. And then politically, we're working to continue to maintain the Assad regime as the pariah state it deserves to be considered, as long as it does not change its ways. Thus, no return to the Arab League, as you just heard earlier. Thus, we will not allow refugees to be pushed back into the arms of this criminal. They have to go back voluntarily, and of the many millions, only a few 100,000 have gone back, despite many incentives that are laid out, particularly by the Russians. So we are willing to continue this, but at the same time, we are trying to work with the Russians and with our other partners and friends to find another way forward, to implement 2254's ceasefire provisions, the withdrawal of all foreign forces except those who were there before 2011, which is coincidentally the Russian forces, and to ensure that the political process culminating in elections and a different kind of government will take place, and all of us can rest more easy that Syria is not going to blow up and drag the whole region down with it, as we have seen before. This is the most dangerous crisis in the region today. It wraps up Iran, it wraps up Russia, it wraps up U.S. interests and those of many other countries. Thank you for your attention, and I think we'll have a moderated discussion in just a moment.
Thank you again for coming, and thank you for agreeing to take some questions. You mentioned this in passing, but I would like to follow up on it. You also said that there's another country that is, you won't specify by name, but is flying over Syria on occasion. So let's talk about that, if I may. Let's talk about U.S.-Israel coordination in Syria, on Syria. Is it fruitful? Is it helpful? How close is it?
Thanks for that question. First of all, our coordination with Israel on Syria, just as our coordination with Israel on many other issues, particularly in the security realm, is very close, is very, very rich, and I think it is very productive. The United States recognizes, accepts the security problems of Iranian and Iranian-led forces, particularly those with long-range systems, in Syria as an existential threat to Syria. The actions that Israel takes or allegedly takes or is contemplating taking against those threats, we support Israel 1,000% in, and we'll do all we can to ensure that Israel is able to continue to defend its security. In terms of coordination, we just talked about the three national security advisors, including John Bolton, here just a week ago. I was out here with Mike Pompeo, and we met the Prime Minister. I've met the Prime Minister and his staff 2 other times. This is all since September, and there have been all kinds of other contacts at the level of our ambassador, our Near Eastern Assistant Secretary. Up until 2 weeks ago, David Satterfield probably had 15 discussions at high levels on Syria over the past year.
But are there any differences between these ready positions? Is there a daylight or no daylight?
Essentially, for not only public but private consumption, we are essentially as close as any two countries I have ever seen on a set of security issues as complex as this.
All right. And then let's add the third player. Are Israel, America, and Russia's interests, from your understanding, are we getting closer with the Russians in terms of shared interests, or?
That's a really good question. It's a question that I ask myself all the time because my leaders ask that of me. The Russians have indicated real interest in what we call our Plan B, the step-by-step carrying out of 2254 with the Constitutional Committee, the elections, moving towards a different kind of Syria, and a withdrawal of foreign forces, a de-escalation of the fighting. We've seen several examples of that. I accompanied Mike Pompeo to Sochi in May, where we met with President Putin and talked about primarily Syria and Iran's role in Syria. And then, as you just saw, the Russians were willing to participate in an unprecedented, as we heard earlier, historic meeting of the three national security advisors in Jerusalem to talk about Middle Eastern security. So the Russians are sending all sorts of signals, and this also came up, of course, Syria and the Middle East in the discussions that President Trump had with President Putin just several days ago. This all sends us a signal that the Russians are very interested in, first of all, the reality that we're talking about the issue, and secondly, the option to do something about the issue. Note how I phrased.
Collectively, perhaps?
In the end, collectively, we can't do this alone with the Russians. You notice I keep citing UN Resolution 2254. Yes. That's what the international community has signed up to. We aren't alone in putting pressure on the Syrians. As I indicated, it's the international community that's doing this by denying reconstruction assistance, by denying return to the Arab League. We're not even in the Arab League. And the Turkish actions in the Northwest, and on and on. We rely on many countries, all of whom are as horrified by this conflict as we are, working together to push the conflict towards a peaceful resolution.
Two quick follow-up questions. You mentioned earlier the military presence of the United States and its allies in Syria. And the statements in late December, I believe I recall correctly, created some concern here in Israel. Are the U.S. forces in Syria, you mentioned Al-Tanf and also northeast Syria, are they there to stay for the foreseeable future? Are they about to come out?
Let me make a couple of initial comments on that. That's a very, very good question, and it's a question that, as you can understand, comes up all the time.
I'm sure.
First of all, those forces are there for one mission authorized by Congress, and that is the enduring defeat of Daesh. Right now, we're in kind of a counterinsurgency campaign against remaining Daesh elements that are sprinkled about, gone to ground, and we're trying to root them out, screen them and such. It's very different than the fight against the caliphate, which was holding territory. But still, it's an important mission. Secondly, the president, like any American president, as commander-in-chief, can decide at any time what he or she wants to do with those forces. So with those two preliminary comments in mind, first of all, the president never intended for the U.S. to pull out of the northeast, to pull out of Syria. He always intended to keep our forces in Al-Tanf in the south. And even in the north, we were going to maintain our critically important air cover over the northeast. We would be providing logistics, and we would be providing what we call the high-end or the black special operations activities, as he announced publicly when he was in Iraq, against any ISIS targets we see in the northeast. What he was trying to do was to encourage for the small force that we would be leaving on the ground, our allies in the coalition. There's some 80 countries and organizations in the anti-ISIS coalition, including essentially all of our NATO partners and allies. Come on in and take over some of this burden. Why should the United States, which is facing challenges in the Pacific, challenges in Europe, challenges with Iran, challenges in Afghanistan, can't you help? And what we had to report back to the president was, they're all saying, in with you, out with you. We need some of your folks there. So the president determined in February and announced publicly that we would withdraw our forces, but we would do this in a deliberate and very careful way. And we would leave for the foreseeable future, to be defined, a residual force of Americans.
As we end, I have a very simple question because I'm sure you're accustomed already to Israeli skepticism, cynicism, realism, or whatever you wish. When you talk about the future of Syria, about the transition, elections, rebuilding Syria, are you today more optimistic or more pessimist?
I'm optimistic because more than any other conflict that I've dealt with, and I've dealt with many since Vietnam, the entire international community is locked in on this. I named our 6 key partners. We have many other partners, but basically I've grouped them in the 6 various groups. That's Israel, Turkey, our SDF partners in the Northeast, the Arab states, the European Union, and the UN. Those are groupings that normally don't all come together on any one issue, and in fact, between them, there are internally major differences. Think of Israel and Turkey. And even on Syria, they differ on how they prioritize the things they want fixed in Syria, but everybody basically wants the same list, if not in the same priority, and they're all working cooperatively with each other and with us. So I think that how much of this we're going to get, that is something that in the end, Mr. Putin, the Iranian mullahs, and Assad himself will have to decide. But we are going to continue this maximum pressure campaign. We use that in referring to Iran, and we're doing the same thing with Syria until we start seeing some flexibility on the other side.
Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your views. And we are ready now to move to the following session. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.